Hi, I'm Fiona Morris of Fiona Morris Designs, and in this video I want to show you how to work a basic standard 2-row buttonhole. So I've got a sample here in front of me, 2 buttonholes here which you can see have been worked using the standard 2-row buttonhole on a sideways knitted band. It can also be worked in moss stitch. So on this one here I've got the buttonholes which have been worked in moss stitch on that garment, and then I've got a third garment here where again the buttonholes have been worked, this time in garter stitch. With most of my designs I usually work a sideways knitted band, so I'm going to demonstrate the buttonhole with a simulated sideways knitted band. I'll just move the garments out of the way and grab my knitting. So I've started knitting a garter stitch band, which if it was the buttonholes on a garment I would have picked up the band along the edge of the garment, but for purposes of demonstration I've just cast on a number of stitches. I also usually work the first row of the 2-row buttonhole with the wrong side facing me, because as I'm working across the row in garter stitch I'm going to be casting off with the knit stitch, which means that the cast off edge, the cast off chain, will roll to the inside, so it just gives a slightly neater finish on the right side of the garment. So if I start knitting across the row, and normally you would have a few stitches from the edge before you work your first stitch, your first buttonhole. So I'm now going to start working my first 3-stitch buttonhole. So again you would knit the first, so that's my first stitch cast off. Just bring a bit more yarn around, and I knit the next stitch, lift it over, second stitch. You want a fairly firm cast off, but you don't want it too tight that the button won't go through, and that's my third cast off stitch. I now need to continue knitting across the row, and in the pattern it should tell you how many stitches to knit between buttonholes. And now I'm going to knit my next 3-stitch buttonhole. So we knit the first stitch, knit the next stitch and cast off 1, cast off 2, cast off 3, and then work to the end of the row. So I've now worked my 2 buttonholes here. So I'm now coming back on the other side to complete the buttonholes. So you will knit up to the buttonhole. So here I am at my buttonhole. I now need to cast on some new stitches to fill up the gap. So you need to turn your knitting around so that you can work the cast on. And probably the best cast on to work for a buttonhole, because it is a firm cast on, is what's called the cable cast on, which means knitting between the stitches. So I'm going to go into between the first and second stitch and bring a new loop through and then twist it on to my left needle. So that's 1, then again between those first 2 stitches, bring a new loop through, cast it on, and then the third. And this is where I use a little trick which seems to help with the problem a lot of people encounter when they do standard buttonholes, that they get a long thread of yarn across the corner of the buttonhole which doesn't look very neat. So I've brought my third stitch onto my right, made my new stitch on my right needle, before I place it on the left needle, I'm going to bring the working yarn between the needles and then place that third stitch on my left needle. If I now turn around so that I can continue knitting across the row. Now I know some people would use something like the single thumb twist or backward loop cast on for buttonholes, because it's a cast on that allows you to travel in the same direction as the knitting is moving, so you don't have to turn your needles around. But it's not a very firm cast on, so what tends to happen if you use that method is that your buttonhole will stretch, which means that after a while your button may keep popping out of the buttonhole. So we're at the second position for the buttonhole, and I've got to cast on 3 more stitches, so I'm going to do the cable cast on again. Between 2, bring the new stitch through and twist it on, and again just bring some more yarn out, twist it on, and then for my third stitch, before I work the third stitch, I'm going to bring the yarn between the needles to the front, turn my knitting around again, and continue across the row. At the moment it probably doesn't look any different to any other cast on buttonhole, but if I knit the next row, hopefully it will show you that you haven't got the problem of that loose strand cutting across the corner of the buttonhole, and it does give you a nice, neat, firm buttonhole. So we'll just get to the other end. So there are lots of different methods of making buttonholes, but this is one of the simpler methods of making a buttonhole that's larger than 1 stitch. So I've worked to the end, and now if I turn it round again, you can see even in this big chunky yarn that I've got a nice neat buttonhole. There aren't any strands hanging across the edge of the knitting, and it sits quite nicely within the garter stitch. So that's how to make a standard 2-row horizontal buttonhole.